Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people who can help us to understand the risks posed by human decision-making and what we can do to mitigate them. Now, one of the most obvious facets of human behaviour is the idea that we all make mistakes. On the face of it, of course, mistakes are something we want to avoid. They're often embarrassing, and they're not something we naturally like talking about. Yet we also know that mistakes can sometimes lead to amazing discoveries like penicillin. If we want innovation, then we'll need to engage in trial and error to see what works. As someone who spends a lot of time looking at human risk, I'm drawn to the idea of exploring mistakes, why we make them, and what we can do to mitigate the kind we don't want and promote the kind we do. My guest this time, Stefan Gaillard, is also fascinated by mistakes. He's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Trial and Error, a publication which seeks to explore failures in academia as a productive means of learning from them. As we explore in our discussion, learning from mistakes isn't just about exposing the error. It's also about exploring why things went wrong. I think there are some real lessons from what Stefan and his colleagues are trying to do, both from the perspective of innovation, but also in managing human risk. After all, if we can understand mistakes and what drives them, then we can help mitigate the wrong kind and promote the beneficial kind. As you'll hear, Stefan is a lot of fun to speak to, and it's actually a really fun topic to talk about. After all, there's something innately entertaining about exploring mistakes, why we make them, and what we do when they've occurred. So please enjoy my conversation with Stefan Gaillard on errors, screw-ups, failures, and mistakes. Or as he puts it, trial and error. Stefan, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. Slightly ironic, perhaps, that you're having me, but I think we'll come to that later.
I choose my guests very carefully, so there's method to the madness. But look, thank you for joining. I'm really looking forward to this. Before we kind of dive into the thing that you've just sort of subtly referenced there, can you give my listeners a little bit of a sense of who you are and what your area of specialism is?
Yeah, so I've been trying to avoid having an area of specialty since I started in academia. So I'm doing a bit of everything. I'm a political staff member at a local municipal party. I do some science journalism at the University of Utrecht. And I also do research at the Utrecht University. And my research mainly concerns the open science movement, and especially sociological and scientometric approaches to the open science movement.
For listeners that don't know, can you just explain what open science is?
Yeah, so open science is quite a broad movement within academia that aims to make science more open. But how exactly that looks like differs a bit between the different schools of thought within open science. But common examples are, for example, the movement to make articles open access so that they are no longer behind a paywall, so that scientific results are easily findable and readable for everyone. So not just people who happen to study at a university or work at a university that has a subscription to the journal, but just have every paper be free to read.
Amazing. Wow. So that's a lot of stuff. And the reason I came across you is I discovered that you had started something with some colleagues that I thought was incredible on a number of levels. It's called the Journal of Trial and Error. And maybe we can just start by asking what that is and how it came about.
Yeah, so how it came about is, again, related to open science. So you'll maybe see that that's going to be a theme in my life. So we went to a lecture on open science, me and the other two co-founders. And it was really interesting, for example, this open access idea. So you research something as a scientific community, but then what use is that if nobody can read it? But then we started wondering, okay, but that's still just being able to access that which is published. But there must be things that are not published. For example, failure. So, for example, during my own bachelor research and this other person during their master research, we had done a study and we had failed to find the results that we expected. And our supervisors, of course, immediately thought, oh, there must have been a mistake in how you did the research, because we expected a different result. Our previous own research got other results, so it must have gone wrong somehow. And that can of course be the case. It can also be the case that our results were true and somehow it differed for other reasons, or maybe their own previous research wasn't as flawless as they like to believe. But all these questions are interesting questions that are not talked about if you don't publish about failure. So what we really wanted to tackle is what is called the file drawer problem in academia. So that's the idea that positive results are far more likely to be published than negative results. And we thought, well, there's no good scientific reason to do this. This has happened for institutional reasons over the years, but there's no good scientific argument to not publish about failure. So that's what we try to address. So now we publish about failure in a multitude of ways. So mainly about failure in empirical research, so natural sciences and social sciences mostly. Also because there it's quite clear when something has failed. Especially in the social sciences, often you can just do a statistical test and see that you didn't get the result that you expected, for example. So we want to publish studies where everything went perfectly well, but the outcome was different from expected. So that's failure in a way. But we also want to publish studies where methodological flaws were made, for example, so that the researcher actually did make a mistake. But this can be interesting for a lot of reasons. So the two big reasons are this mistake is perhaps being made by the scientific community at large. So a very famous example that we like to use, I use it in almost all of my talks, but it's so salient that it's just perfect. It's the dead salmon in an fMRI scanner. So an fMRI scanner is a machine, and it measures brain activity. And some researchers put a dead salmon in it. They measured, they did statistical analysis, and significant brain activity. So either there was some voodoo going on, or there was something going wrong with the method being used. Well, of course, it happened to be the latter. But this method and this statistical analysis was being used by neuropsychologists around the world. So their mistake was indeed a mistake, but it was a mistake being made by scientists all over the world. So it's very interesting to publish about that because you want to rectify that mistake. And the other type of mistake that's interesting is when you're trying to develop a new method. So for me, it's very intuitive that this will go wrong. I mean, if you're an engineer, you also don't expect your first prototype to work. So I don't know why this is so looked at so differently in science. So if you make a new method, it's probably going to go wrong. But that doesn't mean it's not interesting, because if you don't publish about it, nobody will know that this new method has been tried. And then in a lab 2,000 kilometers away, 2 months later, after you found out that you failed, but you didn't publish anything about it, somebody might check the internet, see that there's no publication on this new method that they came up with, and then try it themselves for another 6 months, and then again find out that it doesn't work, and then again not publish about it, etc. So, in those regards, we think mistakes are very interesting, and we also try to supplement that with reflection articles about what failure is, what failure means in certain contexts, and those are written by philosophers or people with a strong theoretical background in the field, people like that.
And I find this amazing because what you say, two reasons it really resonated with me. The first one is when you describe it like that, it's really kind of obvious because you kind of think, well, innovation happens because we have trial and error. We test stuff out and we see what works. And of course, we all naturally do that as kids. We test the world out to see how things work, and we get controlled by adults to stop us going too far in our experimentation. But that's how we learn. And so I find this idea, you highlight is very natural and intuitive and sensible as a sort of human thing. But then we go to the flip side, and what you've described there, this sort of inability or unwillingness, and I want to unpack which of those it is, if or maybe both in a minute. But there's this inability to publish. It's the same challenge that we have when you look at, say, something like biographies, right? Where you will write biographies about successful business people and sports people, and we don't write biographies about losers because nobody's interested. And so we have the same concept, which is sort of, we want to share success stories. We want to share when things have worked out. We want to listen to people that know what's right. But as you rightly point out, there's a lot of lessons from things going wrong, which is the whole basis of scientific experiment. So all of that leads me to a basic thing of sort of saying, on the one hand, I understand hugely why this doesn't happen. On the other hand, I'm intrigued as to why doesn't it?
Yeah. So I also quickly want to go into your biography example, because I think that another very interesting point is that it also distorts the image of science. So, for example, with biographies, I think it's well known, but perhaps the survivor bias. So, for example, many successful people, they think they were successful because of all these common shared characteristics with other people publishing successful biographies. But in the end, it also happens to be a lot of luck, and all of the people who tried the same method but didn't become successful, they don't get a nice biography. So that data isn't even considered. And so I also think that publishing this way about science also negatively distorts how we look at science. So for the lay public, you get this image of, you get this newspaper heading, 10 million in funding for shiny new research, and then 5 years later you hear about all the nice results they got, but you don't hear about the 5 years of indeed trial and error that they went through. And especially now during COVID, I think that it's sort of backfiring, because when the models change, people are like, oh, I thought the scientists were supposed to know what they're doing. They keep changing the models every 3 months. And I'm like, yeah, that's what we do. That's what we've been doing for the past couple of decades, but it's not how we've been presenting it. So I also think that the image is a very important component. But then coming back to your question, why it isn't being done. Yeah, that's hard to grasp, because there have been a few initiatives in the past that did similar things, but mostly usually in one specific field. So, for example, in mathematics, you had a journal that only accepted papers that were rejected in other journals. So, slightly different concept, but in the same area. But they didn't get enough. They didn't get enough papers after a couple of issues, and so that's also very interesting. And that's one of the projects I still want to do, is interview all these people that have tried this in the past and have failed, which is very thematic and also
right. And logically,
scary.
they're not going to have published, right? Because for the very reasons you've outlined. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, I don't know how this came about. I think some journals are trying to remedy this. So they say, like PLOS ONE, they say we will publish both negative and positive results. But then when you look at the actual numbers, it's still like 90% positive results and 10% negative results, whereas that's nowhere near the actual actual statistics of positive and negative results happening in the lab, for example. So yeah, I think it's become a sort of self-sustaining vicious cycle that almost everyone wants to get out of, but because of funding structures and institutional structures and how prestige works right now, it's quite hard to get out of. But how we ever came here is also a mystery that I with a historical background would also one day like to really figure out. But yeah, it feels like nobody wants to do it like this, but somehow almost everybody still does it like this. So
right, that's a very interesting. And so you came up with this idea with your colleagues, and you started to implement it. What was the reaction from the kind of the academic community, or even the vested interests that don't want to do this?
Yeah, so from the academic community, well, we called it in the beginning enthusiastic silence. So everybody we met, at the beginning at least, later we got some more pushback, but at the beginning everybody was like, what a fantastic idea. I really hope you get a lot of submissions. And then we were like, oh, will you be sending in a submission? No. So that's what we call enthusiastic silence. Everybody was enthusiastic, but almost nobody wanted to send something in. So a lot of more junior researchers said, if I owned my research, I would send it in. But the data is owned by my supervisor, and I can't convince them to send it in to this journal centered around failure. So that was one problem we encountered. But slowly people started warming up to actually also sending in themselves. So now we have people from PhD level to professor level sending things in, but it's still way less than you would expect based on the enthusiastic response. So also, for example, at the end of, I think, August, I was interviewed by Times Higher Education. There was a tweet about it, and we had like dozens of retweets of scientists saying, "Oh, haha, I have so much to send into this journal." Yeah, I know, like, we have a laugh because they failed so much in their career, but almost none of them actually sent something in. So, yeah, the response has been very enthusiastic, but people are still hesitant to actually do it themselves. But also, as I've said, that's also changing. So past couple of months, we've been getting more and more people sending in their articles, so that's very nice. And then from the establishment, we actually got invited by, for example, Elsevier to talk with them about the concept of our journal. And they told us they tried something similar a couple of years ago and it didn't work, and they were interested in how we were managing to make it work. So, yeah, the establishment is also, I think they're just interestingly watching us to see how it continues, whether we'll crash and burn or it will be a success. But yeah, those have been the main responses, just enthusiasm, but not really contributing, or sort of really eyeing like where will this be going the next couple of months.
Right, and the people that have submitted stuff,
yeah,
is it sort of the equivalent of if you go for an interview, right, and they ask you what your weaknesses are, the natural human tendency, right, is to kind of come up with, you know what I mean, right? Come up with something that's not a weakness. So you go, oh, I'm so focused on the detail that some people find it really difficult, right? So in other words, you're turning something that's not a weakness and you're pretending it's a weakness.
Yeah.
So is there a sense of, and I don't want to criticize the people that have supported your project, so I'm just talking in general terms, right? Is there a sense of people are giving it, when they are sending things, is it genuinely mistakes, or is it stuff that's sort of like, look at this terrible mistake I've made that's not actually a mistake?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question, because indeed, we're also looking at other types of mistakes. People talking about mistakes in academia. So there was also this very famous CV of failures, and it was right. And it was published, I think, by a professor from Princeton. I'm not 100% sure, so don't pin me down on that. But a very successful academic person, at least. And at first, everybody's like, "Oh, so great that you're so confident that you published a whole CV of things that you were rejected from." And then somebody else, very cynically but very truthfully, pointed out, "Yeah, okay, but it's pretty easy for you to now publish that. Now that you've got tenure, that you're very successful, there's not much to lose." It's more sort of like, yeah, indeed, it becomes a sort of humble brag that you've also failed in your life, but you're still super successful, so nobody cares. But yeah, no, I think the first couple of articles, they were for me truthfully failures. So as I said, they are also coupled with a reflection article. And for example, the first empirical article was coupled with a reflection article, and the reflection article was extremely critical on the empirical article, so much so that I almost thought, like, should I send a mail to this reflection writer, like, but it's the purpose of our journal to publish about failures, so maybe not be too harsh in criticizing the failures that they made. But I didn't in the end, because it sort of defeats the purpose. But yeah, no, there are indeed mistakes, but I think they're mostly from indeed people who are either already quite successful and have less to lose, or quite idealistic young academics that are really like, I don't want to work in such an environment for a couple of 40 years. Something needs to be done, and they're taking the brunt of it. But yeah, I do consider the articles that have been sent in so far actual failures. Yeah.
Wow. So I mean, it's interesting when you talk in those terms, because so if somebody comes forward, they're not just going, "This is where I screwed up." What they get based on what you've just said is a commentary, a review of that, and an analysis. So you could say, I mean, what you're asking there is kind of tough, because it's sort of, one, admit it happened in a way that you don't normally have to, and then two, let's have a look and analyze, kind of go in and do like it's almost like a TV documentary sort of thing that comes in and does a review. Let's have a really good look at this.
Yeah.
So there's two kind of barriers to what you're proposing that make so I guess sort of that makes it doubly tough in a way for people.
Yeah, no, that's very true. That's also, we've also contemplated like anonymizing these things, not having the reflection articles, other types of solutions that might increase the amount of articles being sent in. But in the end, we think that the discourse, the talks surrounding failure really need to change. And to make that happen, you need to have these people who are brave enough to do this. So I really respect the people sending it in, because you're publishing about your failure, and as you say, you're having this person you probably don't even know analyzing in a 4,000 word essay exactly what you did wrong. But I think that's the way forward, because as I said, there have been initiatives in the past that did something similar, and they dried up because they didn't get enough submissions. And then you can say, oh, you should lower the barriers maybe, but I think that's a temporary solution. I think that the real solution is that it shouldn't feel like such a barrier to send it in, to talk about your mistakes, and to have other people honestly looking at those mistakes. And also they try to see what you can learn from those mistakes. So it's not only 4,000 words of how you screwed up, but 4,000 words about, oh, this went wrong, but it's still really interesting because of these and these reasons.
And what's the reaction been from people that have submitted? Because I could sort of see two things that would happen. One is kind of like the Catholic confession equivalent, right? So you've put this out there, and it's kind of a weight off your mind, right? Because nobody can criticize you for it. You've been upfront about it, so you've got the burden is removed. And then the second bit is this sort of, actually, it's quite helpful to have somebody else to look at what you've done and kind of help you, give you that independent perspective on what might have gone wrong. So I could sort of see both a kind of, a sort of soulful response, which is that you feel better about it. But the second thing is you might get something useful. How have people tended to react to it?
It's been a bit of a mix of those two, I'd say. So also, so one of the first offers sending it in was a junior researcher. So they were also just generally excited to have another publication. So I think that's also...
Okay, right. So you could say, I can't get published anywhere else, right? But I've got loads of content for these guys and they'll publish, right?
I mean, in a very cynical way, yes. Because, I mean, again, that's what we talked about earlier about these structures that you're in. You're still in the publish or perish mentality. So that's at academia, you're expected to publish X amount of times per year, and that really puts a lot of pressure on you. So if you're then not even able to publish your failures, that's that's extra pressure, right? Because let's say 50% of your research is failure, then you can only publish 50% of it, namely the positive results, and you have to do even more work to get those publications. Whereas if you can also publish your negative results, that's if they are considered equal to your positive results. That's the second question, of course, but that's a weight off your shoulders in a way. But yeah, we've also had authors send in articles that said where we're trying to develop this new EEG paradigm, so brainwave measurements. We didn't succeed, but we got some interesting insights. And for them, it's really interesting indeed to have this peer-reviewed, to have this reflection article on it, to see how they can move forward with that paradigm, how other people can use what they've discovered so far to also try and develop this new brain measurement paradigm. So for them, it's very interesting to get feedback and also to be able to help other researchers in a similar field that are trying to develop something similar. And I think that's what most scientists try to do, except you only build off each other's work when it's a success. But I think you can also build off each other's work when there's no success. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag of why people are what people are expecting from what they send in.
That's fascinating. And logical question then is what have you learned about mistakes and why we make them and those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's why I said in the beginning it's perhaps ironic that I'm on this show, because if I understand correctly, it's about trying to prevent mistakes from being made, whereas we're more focused from learning them, not necessarily preventing them.
Well, I look at it and say, if you take the idea that there's no such thing as a new idea, right? We're all recycling, which is, slightly flawed premise, but I like the simplicity around. Then I would say, look, any mistake that anybody makes is somebody's probably made something similar before. It might just be in a different context. Yeah. So I look at these things and go, I'm trying to prevent bad things from happening. And of course, there's a definition as to what bad means. And when you get into things like ethics, it gets really interesting because it's less obvious sometimes. But I look at those things and I sort of go, I think there's a tremendous amount that we can learn from errors and mistakes. And very often, one of the reasons I think people screw up is because they try and hide stuff, because we don't make it acceptable for there to be mistakes. And so you see lots of examples that I look at where there's something relatively small, but there is no route for that person to admit there's been a mistake. And it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, because they try and cover it up, because the consequences are they lose their job, maybe they go to jail. There's a whole load of reasons why we would cover something, or they're just embarrassed, or they think they can deal with it themselves. But there's a reason that drives that activity. And so I think one of the biggest drivers of human risk out there is actually this thing that says we can't be honest, and we force people through processes. We force them to lie and to pretend that everything's perfect. So the very dynamics that you talk about around why it's difficult for people to publish and why they might not want to, I think applies across society. And this is why I'm fascinated by this topic, because I think we put boundaries around people that says, talk about success, but I don't want to hear about failure, because that makes you, to use Trump-like language, that makes you a loser, right? And that's bad. And it's not. So for me, actually, you're right. There's no irony in that I'm out there trying to stop this stuff and you're out there trying to highlight it. But I think there's so much that we can learn. And I sort of, I have on Twitter, I literally, my Twitter feed is very much, I sort of find stories in the news. Like, here's another example of human risk. And what's fascinating is that there are so many repeat performances. There are so many planes that have issues because of pilot error. Now, of course, pilot error doesn't necessarily mean pilot error. There's so many times people have screwed stuff up because they've put the wrong number in a spreadsheet. There's so many times people have fallen asleep. Right. And there's these repeat themes. So, yeah, you're right. It's ironic, but I also think it's super valuable. And what I want to get to the bottom of is to say, if we can't admit that we made mistakes, we will just we'll keep making the same ones, and we'll keep digging ourselves into a hole, because we'll just create more and more situations. Because I have a theory that if you can get away with not talking about your mistakes once, then you'll keep not talking about them, but you'll make bigger and bigger ones as you go. So I agree with you on the irony thing, but I think this is really valuable.
Yeah, and so what I've learned from it touches also on that, because I think on a community level, a lot of what you said also happens. So learning from mistakes should happen at the level of the scientific community. So I've been baffled at the amount of manpower and money being wasted in a sense, because some of the examples that I've given might seem a bit over the top, but we've literally been to a conference where we gave a talk about a journal, and somebody came up to us and they told us a story that they worked for 6 months developing a new method. It didn't work. They didn't publish about it. They did give a small talk about it at a conference, because they thought, I can at least do that. And the feedback that she got was, oh, but we already knew that didn't work. And she was like, huh? But I scoured the internet, I scoured the published record, and nothing mentioned this. And they said, no, of course we didn't publish about it, but it's sort of known within our circles that this doesn't work. But yeah, well, if you're not yet part of that circle, if you're a beginning researcher, for example, if you haven't been to a lot of conferences where people casually mention that this method doesn't work, you've just wasted six months of manpower and money on something that was apparently already known, but nobody wanted to publish about. So that's one of the biggest amazements that I've had. And also, what I've really learned is that how connected a lot of the problems in science are to not talking about failure. So, for example, the replication crisis. So that's in a lot of the sciences in the last, I think, 10 years, they found out that a lot of their studies don't replicate. So if you do the same study another time, you don't find the same result. And this is a large problem because as a science, at least some of the sciences, as a philosopher of science, I try to not generalize too much. But for a lot of the sciences, you're trying to find a law or a strong pattern. So if something doesn't replicate, that's problematic if you're trying to find a law or a strong pattern, because you would expect the same result again. And I think that also has to do, for example, with not being open about failure. Because if you do 100 studies and 50 go right and 50 go wrong, and you only publish about the 50 that go right, and then you do the same 100 studies again, and then you suddenly find, oh, in this replication bunch, we had a lot of failure, whereas in the original bunch, we only saw success. How is this possible?
Right.
but they also occurred, but you just don't know it because it wasn't published.
But that's really interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking about children's fairy tales, right? Now, but I think there's something interesting in this because as you grow up, right, we get told these stories and they always end okay, right? So there's always an evil, and it's normally some sort of evil person, evil animal, whatever, right? And you know, whether it's Little Red Riding Hood or whatever, so it's all okay in the end, but they go through these horrible experiences. Now, what we don't do, and I know why, because we don't want to scare the hell out of kids, right? We don't ever have them finishing going, that didn't work out, right? Maybe the wolf ends up eating everybody and wins, right? We don't allow that to happen. The evil, anybody who's called evil in children's books, right, always loses in the end, right? We create this thing in the same way that James Bond always succeeds against all the odds to fight the villains. You pick your, and it's very unusual for the kind of the heroes to not survive and win the day, right? So Prince Charming and the princess, they always go off, and it's all sort of positive stuff. And there's something about what you've just described, right, which gives people a skewed view of the world. Now, we're teaching children basic morals and basic things, and we want them to think that if you're well behaved, you know, that you do the right things and you're morally correct, that good things will happen to you. Now, we're adults. We know this is not true. And we got plenty of examples of people that have been successful, who are immoral, who do unpleasant things. So we know that that's not reality. But what's fascinating is what you've just talked about there is exactly the problem with this thing, which is, as you say, if I look at someone's research and they go, wow, they got all these amazing results, and you don't see the hours and the failure, you're going to have a totally skewed view. It's not going to help you progress your piece. So from a societal perspective, fine to do that for kids. I'm not suggesting that we write horror stories, but it's interesting that continues in the way that you've talked about. And that's just what a waste of time and effort. And also just giving people the wrong sense of stuff. And so really what you're highlighting, as you pointed out, is a real waste of resources that people are kind of discovering the same mistake. Now, there's a benefit sometimes. I guess that to a certain point, you need to go through that process for learning. So driving, we don't just turn around to people and go, hey, by the way, if you drive quickly, you'll have an accident. Just take my word for it. Right? We let people test it out. We don't let them crash, but we kind of let them experience it. Or put kids on bicycles, same thing. So there's an argument that says it's healthy for you to kind of go through that same process, but it might be better for you to go through that same process knowing there's a stronger, at least the success rate of what you're doing. It would be better if you actually understood what that realistically looked like. Yeah.
So there's a lot of interesting things that you touched upon because also I think from a societal standpoint, we already talked about wasting of human resources and money because in the end, it's usually the taxpayer paying for scientific research. But it goes even further than that, especially in medicine, for example. So let's say you have medicine A and medicine B. And what often happens is that you try to compare which of these is more effective for treating a disease, right? And you don't do just one research. You do, for example, 100 research for researchers for both, 100 studies, for both, and then you compare which is the most successful. And this actually happens. But if you, again, only publish the positive results, so let's say medicine A works in 60 cases, but not in 40 cases, and you only publish those 60 cases that work, then it looks like the medicine is effective 100% of the time, whereas that's absolutely not the case. And this has actually happened, and that medicine is prescribed by doctors who don't know better. And of course they don't, because they use the published scientific record to base their decisions on, and so this has huge societal impact. If you look, for example, at medicine, but also political science and other studies that are more directly related to society, and also the moral aspect. An argument that I find very interesting is that all research that is done with participants, you have a sort of obligation to them to publish that research. So if I do a psychological study and 100 people participate, or I do a medical study and 1,000 people participate, I have this sort of obligation to them to publish my results. They sacrificed their time and effort, usually for no pay or like below minimum wage pay, to advance science. But because you didn't get the result you were expecting, or the scientific community doesn't get the result they were expecting, you don't publish it. Whereas I would indeed say you have some sort of obligation to those people who helped you in conducting your research. And
it's interesting when we learn ourselves, right? Because you wouldn't do that with your own. Now we might try and so there's an interesting point here where I will try and shut out really big mistakes. I might go, one response to those big mistakes is to go, never happened, right? Pretend that never happened, and I can move on blissfully. But equally, on some level, I will know that it's happened. And we all know that I don't know, if you've had a car accident, you'll overcompensate for your driving for a while at least. And so we do so some of us continue to make the same mistakes we've always made, guilty as charged, but we also try and learn from those things. So it's sort of interesting when you talk about that somehow, because it involves other people or other people's money, right? It feels okay to keep quiet in a way that we wouldn't do in ourselves. So what you're describing there is a sort of unnatural response to a situation, or maybe it's very, but you would sort of go that there are externalities here that you need to bear in mind.
Yeah. So indeed, also touching upon the trial and error process, I find it very interesting because indeed to have the example of riding your bike, for example, I think most people consider your academic training to be the equivalent of learning to ride the bike. So during your bachelor, your master, or undergraduate or graduate degrees, then it's still fine to fail. You're still learning. And then suddenly when you switch from graduate to your PhD, for example, magically everything should go right? So
because you know what you're doing now, right?
Yeah, you go from learning to ride a bicycle to never, ever being allowed to fall from your bicycle again, suddenly. And I think that's very unnatural, because indeed, even as an adult, I sometimes fall from my bike. And telling people about that might also give me insights on why I fell from my bike. So I think indeed there are these negative externalities that make it different from being able to admit about mistakes in other areas of life. And so one of them is that there's a lot on the line. So if I tell you that I fell from my bike while I'm 26, you might laugh and say, haha, you're 26. And this still sometimes happens to you, and that's it. Whereas if I'm afraid of my academic career that I've been building up for years, that's a very far higher negative consequence of
There's an interesting thing in behavioral science called the pratfall effect, which is this idea that if people who are seen to be competent, if they make a small mistake, that actually increases the perception of competence rather than decreases it. The limits of that are, of course, if that person makes a massive mistake that's so big, or if they're perceived to be incompetent anyway, that just makes it work. But there is something interesting in that we sort of build in a factor in our thinking that suggests that we sort of expect people to make mistakes. And we kind of know that's built into the human thing, because we spend a lot of time, money, and effort as a society catching those mistakes. And that's why we have insurance, ultimately, I guess, because we know that there's certain things we can't control. So there's something interesting there around, as you say, the societal piece. But I come back to, we inherently know that people make mistakes. It's just something we grow up with. And yet we've got this nice narrative that it doesn't happen. And I think there's something interesting in what you said about the PhD becomes the barrier after which, mistakes are not tolerated. And I think the same thing's true of politicians and business organizations, where there's a sort of, it'd be like childhood. You're allowed to screw things up as a kid, but you shouldn't do that as an adult because you should know better. And there's something quite dangerous about that, in a way, that if we suddenly get that, because you either get people believing it, a certain world leader comes to mind, they've never made a single mistake ever, or you feel like you ought to be that person and you kind of cover it up, which brings us back to the genesis of your journal. Yeah.
So indeed, that the bias you talked about, I think that nicely covers a lot of the things that we talked about. So, for example, that severe failures is also an example of that. So then you have the successful person, and then when they admit to a mistake, then it's suddenly socially acceptable. But it's socially acceptable because they also have a lot of successes to, I guess, compensate, or I don't know what the rationale is. But and then also that works through into how your organization functions. So that can indeed be in politics or in business or in science. So if a junior makes a mistake, it's a bad thing. They might get fired, or you immediately believe that they made a mistake. Whereas if a senior makes the same mistake, then it's suddenly acceptable, or you don't even think they made a mistake. You're just like, oh, I can't believe he made a mistake. He's so successful. I guess something else is going on. So if a senior scientist makes a mistake, or a junior scientist makes a mistake, it's also a large difference in how people react to that. And yeah, I think that puts a lot of pressure on beginning scientists or people at the beginning of their careers to more cover it up, which has all these negative consequences that we talked about, and sort of solidifies, I'm going to sound like a real philosopher now, but power relations that might not be inherently good. So taking the example of science again, if a senior researcher has made mistakes in their previous research, and a junior scientist comes along and shows that with new research, so they do the same research and they get a totally different result, people are far more likely to believe that the junior researcher made an uninteresting mistake because their results deviate from what we've already known from this great professor who has done 5 studies on it. And of course, we shouldn't forget that indeed it might be more likely that the junior scientist made that mistake because, of course, they do have less experience, they might have less funding options, they might have access to things, to less things than the professor. But we should analyze what has been done. We should analyze how the research has been done. We should analyze the results. And then we should say, okay, this person or this person is correct, but not sort of intuitively just assume that because this person is in a more junior position, that they are the one that are not in the right. Again, there might be a stronger statistical likelihood, but it isn't certain. I think you should always keep that in mind and always check. Just base it on the arguments and the results and the findings, etc.
But there's a really interesting societal point there as well, I think, which is if you look at this idea that experience, often people use age as a proxy for experience, but it's sort of any of those things. I've done things a lot. I've been around for a long time. Therefore, I know more than you because you've done less of it. Now, there are some fields where that makes perfect sense, right? You will be better at certain things if you've done it more. You will be more informed about things if you studied them in more detail. But I find it fascinating when you look at the world nowadays, where there are so many changes and things happening that past experience is not necessarily a good guide to the future. And so if we look at COVID, I see lots of people running businesses where the business they're running is not the business they were running. It's suddenly become, a business where we had lots of people in one location has become a business where you've got lots of people in remote locations. I would argue for academia running, where you've got all these issues with COVID spreading on, and what does education mean in the current environment? You were running previously a physical teaching business with some accommodation attached to it. Now you're running a remote learning operation that's fundamentally different, and you've got a customer base that's expecting different things. And we're testing out those balances between how much power does the university have over the students that are paying for. So there's all these sorts of questions that I think kind of demonstrates that it is not always the case that a past experience is a valuable piece. And what you've just highlighted there is a natural tendency, a simple heuristic that we all have to go, oh, well, he or she's been in this space for a long time, therefore, oh, they've got a title, therefore they must know what they're doing. And I would argue that if your past experience for some reason is not relevant to the current or the future, actually, you might be less well equipped to handle this stuff.
Yeah, so I think indeed that the heuristic of age equals experience has gotten a bit out of hand. This immediately reminded me of a tweet that I found so incredibly funny. It was a software developer, and they had developed a language 5 years ago, and they were applying for a job that asked for 10 years experience in that language. So the person who had developed that language didn't qualify for their expectations, but it was impossible. But they just thought, oh, we need someone with a lot of experience in this, so 10 years. And yeah, I think that's a nice indication. And then also I find it interesting that you see universities as primarily education institutes, because that's already indeed an assumption. So if you look at indeed how people look at the university, that's already something that so the old guard, to say it like that, might indeed see the university more as a research institution that happens to do some teaching, whereas the younger generation might, and no, I haven't actually done studies into this, but might look at it more as a educational institution where also research happens. And if a shift happens in what a university is supposed to do, then indeed it isn't logical anymore to assume that people who have been there for long are automatically better suited, because the function of the institute has changed. So it is no longer a good proxy to look at the people that have been there for long.
Right. And that's a very, very fair point. You're right. I look at, it's funny actually, because I do spend my time reading academic research, so I should know better. So that's a beautiful point out but that perception matters immensely, because I've just framed the discussion and the thought process around it. And I'm struck very much around, as we look at things going wrong, there is a question around definition of what being wrong means. And so when I look at, just that example of me kind of from one perspective, I'm totally describing universities. On the other hand, I'm totally not describing them, because they're, depending on which way you look at it. And of course, it's a balance of the two. But as I think about that mistake that I've just made in terms of oversimplifying things, when we look at what you're trying to do with the journal, I mean, how do you define what a mistake is? Because that sort of becomes slightly subjective, right?
Yeah, so now you're touching on about 22-hour meetings.
I know, and if you could just summarize it maybe in a minute, that would be
But yeah, so just the title alone, Journal of Trial and Error, was something that came about after a lot of other thoughts.
After a lot of trial and error, presumably.
Yeah. So at one point, the Journal of Failure also was an option, but we thought that might, from a marketing standpoint, be too much of yeah. But indeed, so we use trial and error, failure, unexpected results. We all use these terms that are all slightly different from each other and might mean different things in different disciplines. So as I said earlier, in social science, it's relatively easy to define failure because you just have statistical methods that tell you when something is considered a failure or not, at least according to the statistical paradigm that is currently in favor. But if you look at the humanities, and we have a lot of discussions with people from the humanities, what does failure mean? It becomes suddenly very difficult to define, because a philosopher, he can make any point, and as long as in a way, so as long as your premises are okay, and the logical steps you take from there are okay, then it's relatively hard to make a mistake. For a historian, it might already be slightly more obvious. You could make a translation mistake, or you could use the wrong archival material for what you are investigating. But so for each discipline within the humanities, it's slightly more easy or less easy to define what failure is, and that more broadly that is the case for all the sciences or Wissenschaften that we're investigating, because you also have this discussion whether the humanities are science or not. But let's say this is academia. So that's also why we have these reflection articles. And I think every person writing a reflection article considers failure in a slightly different way. Or people writing reflection articles might even say, okay, sure, I want to write a reflection article, but I don't consider this a failure that you're publishing. So yeah, that definition I think is quite hard, but it usually does involve things happening that you did not expect, I think. So either your result is different than from what you expected, or you wanted to do something and you made an error while executing that. So
right, and I guess because you're asking people to submit stuff to a certain extent, that has to be the definition, right? Because if you said to someone, submit stuff that objectively is a mistake, but you don't think, but you might not think it is, that's going to be quite a tough piece to deliver. But the second thing is the easiest thing for people to identify is stuff where they go, that didn't work out. So that's sort of by default where you end up to get people to play the game. But it's a really interesting point, isn't it? That if your start point is skewed or different, then I'm always struck by these sort of these kind of experiments that are designed to be successful, whatever, right? So you take a lot. So I'm always thought there's those famous sort of betting ones where you get you effectively get a bunch of people together and you place enough bets so that one of your particular studies is always going to have a winning streak. And so it looks like you've got this great system. So depending on how you set something up in the first place can depend on whether it's deemed to be a success or not. So the terms on which you enter make a huge difference. But you haven't really got a choice with that, I suppose.
Yeah, so with the journal, of course, we do have criteria. So we say for the statistical sciences, if X happens after your statistical analysis, it's considered a failure and you can submit. And we also want to publish about methodological errors, so things like, as I said, that salmon in the fMRI scanner. So then we define it as, and then it's still a gray area because you can't really quantify it. We call it higher methodological errors. So if I'm trying to make a new chemical compound in the lab and I just accidentally knock all my glasswork on the ground, that's a mistake, and it's not really interesting to the scientific community, right? There are also mistakes that are not that interesting.
Right.
So if I just happen to knock something on the ground, that happens, but not that much that people can learn from it. So we try to publish failures with methods that other people can learn from. But it becomes really subjective. So then it's up to the editorial team to determine whether such an article could be interesting for the journal. And having these criteria, in a way, indeed, you have to have them. But also sometimes it really frustrates me because then I get people come to me. They say, I made this and that type of mistake during my research, and I contemplated sending it in to you, but I thought it probably doesn't really fit that criteria because I looked at your criteria and I didn't really recognize my type of mistake in what you described. And I'm like, no, please send it in.
Right, you just made a mistake, right?
Because that sounds super interesting and something that other people can learn from.
Right, and I'm guessing the possibility, as you rightly point out, so you need these criteria, but you could have got that wrong, right? You may be missing some really interesting stuff. So by default, you kind of have to say to people, this is what we think we're looking for, but actually, if you don't fit, because if they're willing enough to send it, then it's probably worth a look.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Also, I don't think many people would want to send in that they have knocked over their glasswork. So indeed, and especially because they have to write it up, right? We talked about this.
So you make
No, but
Right.
it sounds funny, but it's actually a thing, because most academics, they have this huge workload, so they don't have the time or energy to just willy-nilly write 4,000 words about a funny mistake that they think is not interesting. So if somebody already writes up a 4,000 word article on their mistake while under the huge time pressure and doing overwork, etc., that most academics fall under and do, then you can already be pretty sure that's probably going to be interesting. And of course, you still have to do the vetting process. So you still look at it with the editorial team, and you still send it to peer reviewers who might say, "Oh, I don't know how this got through your editorial team, but I would just reject it."
Right.
So you still do the vetting process, of course, but it is a pretty good indicator if they take the time and energy to write it up.
That's interesting. That's a nice bit of self-calibrating policing. And look, I could talk to you forever because I find it fascinating, but we're sort of running out of time slightly. So where do we go from here? Which is, so you keep persuading people to submit. What's your kind of long-term vision for this, or is it just you're so excited by what you're managing to get that we'll tackle that when we get there?
No, so so the really long-term vision, and this sounds maybe a bit humble bragging again, but the real long-term vision is that our journal is no longer needed, right? So we think our journal is currently needed because nobody else is talking about failure in this way. Some journals are publishing some failures, but not nearly enough. And besides publishing about failure, you also need to change how people look at it and how they are talking about it. But if that would have been changed, and if journals just look at how interesting from a scientific standpoint research is, and they publish, let's say, 60% positive results and 40% negative results, and this whole look at failure has changed, then indeed our journal would no longer be necessary. So in a weird way, that would be the ultimate success story, would be that we are no longer needed. But I think more realistically, going forward the next couple of years, is that I would love to see some other journals pop up, perhaps monodisciplinary journals that also only talk about failure, but then for specific fields. So we are a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary journal, so we publish from all scientific fields. But I think it would really help if journals came about that focused on a specific academic field and failure in that academic field, to again increase the amount of articles published about that, how people talk about it in the field, etc. And besides that, I have a lot of smaller side projects in mind. So one big ambition is indeed interviewing all these people who have done something similar in the past and finding out why they failed with a journal about scientific failure. And also just with open science wise, I would love to be involved in new types of publishing, seeing how scientific communication can be, can become better in the future and things like that.
Wow. Well, look, first I will put links to all of your pieces in the show notes so people can find it. But what I think is amazing about this is, as I said at the start, one, it's the kind of thing where once you point it out, you go, why doesn't that happen? So I love people that ask simple questions to which there isn't a good answer. And you've not only asked the question, but you've looked to try and solve the problem. But I think the other thing that's really amazing is I think this is a really good thing for everybody to think about, particularly business, where the same issue exists in the business world. You know, they pretend it's not, they'll have processes, but actually the same dynamics that drive to that apply, and people don't admit to things. And I think there's a very, I see very few examples in the companies I look at where I would go, they're honestly good at talking about mistakes. They'll talk about small things that, as you say, the knocking stuff over in the lab equivalent, my socks didn't match today type mistakes, or it's stuff that was so, coronavirus came along and we couldn't, and they don't, and even that I would argue was predictable. But you look at that middle ground where there's some real learning opportunities there, where I think it's for some reason it doesn't happen. And so I'm really delighted to have this. So I'm going to be shouting loudly about this as a really good example, I think, of academic thinking that has resonance in the business world. So I'm very keen to keep an eye on what you do, because I think it'll hugely help my listeners and clients that I work with to think about the challenge in their own organization. So thank you for, one, being an amazing guest. That was such a lot of fun, and I really learned a lot, and you've caused me to think. The second bit is for the work that you do, and I think it's great. And anybody that challenges traditional thinking and is trying new things is good by me, because that is what we need to solve this stuff. So thank you so much, Stefan.
Well, thank you a lot for having me. And indeed, I'm also hugely interested in human factors. So the field of psychology that looks at how mistakes are made in human-machine interaction, for example. So I forgot when you asked about future ambitions, but I would also love to branch out to business and other fields where I think indeed failure is also not talked about enough yet, and especially how we can learn from failure.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Stefan for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about the Journal of Trial and Error, have a look in the show notes. There's a link to the website there, and you can read some of the articles that they've published. If you're new to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe to it wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the platforms. If you like the show, please do leave a review for it on whichever platform you're using. It really does help. I'll be back with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast very soon. But in the meantime, keep making the right kind of mistakes, avoid the wrong ones, and above all, stay safe. Thanks for listening.